from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Hey, welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. We're going to talk about drones today. In fact, we will be droning on and on and on. I'm sorry. You know, with drones, there's a lot of buzz about that entire topic, and I don't want to get over my head, if you know what I mean, but hey, I'm not going to wing it. Here today is Matt Begert. Matt and I go back. See, we met, I think it was in Haiti in 1923. Was that correct?
I believe that's about right.
Yeah, that was right, yeah. Or Nicaragua, I can't remember. It was the 20s.
It was a banana republic of some sort.
Like so many of us, the 20s, our 20s were just so confusing. But anyway, but no, we met many, many years ago, actually both on assignments where we were not in uniform. And we met at talking to this scientist, engineer, whatever you want to call him, on a rather advanced technology for seeing stuff that you can't see. And we noticed that we both, even though we're wearing civilian clothes, we're wearing, we had both had the same fashionable haircut. And we kind of looked at each other. It's like, are you a Marine? Are you a Marine? And that was back in the 90s. And we have stayed in contact, collaborated, friends ever since then, done stuff all over the place. So, Matt, you're obviously a Marine. I kind of threw that out there, and
you are too, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so. And a fellow retired lieutenant colonel. And
yes, sir.
Matt comes more from the aviation side of the house. But Matt, do you want to just say a couple things about your background? A little bit of, you were born at a very young age, sort of thing.
Yeah, I was born at a very young age, and I was born on a horse ranch in Kansas. I'm a native Kansan. I was around more horses than people till I went to school. And then my dad, who had also been a Marine in World War II, kind of inspired me, and I ran off and joined the Marine Corps. Stayed for about 25 years.
And did
I started in the infantry, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad had been a fighter pilot in World War II, and so I wanted to taste that, so I went to flight school. And then I was involved with a couple other things that was intriguing, but I wanted to get more on the ground, so to speak. So I went to, it's an acronym, I went to LtCol. It's sort of a special ops-ish kind of thing. Enjoyed that, learned how to parachute. And then I ended up, my last tour was doing rather highly technical things with a mostly federal civil servant civilian organization, a White Sands Missile Range, testing rather complicated weapons. Then I worked for the Aerospace Corporation, which had a grant from the Department of Justice, actually a subcomponent of the Department of Justice called the National Institute of Justice, did research. And the point of the grant was to assist state and local law enforcement agencies to improve their capability through technology. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And that kind of leads right into drones. By the way, we're both LtCol Marines.
Yes.
I should mention Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. They work in, for those who don't know, these are if you remember after 9/11, when there were these little special teams running around in Afghanistan, they were doing kind of the LtCol mission. They were calling in air, not a lot of naval gunfire because it is Afghanistan, but they were calling in a lot of airstrikes and stuff, and that's what LtCol does. We will literally parachute in, so to speak, and meet up with host nation forces or partisan forces or whomever, and control air support, and if close to the coastline, naval gunfire. And that's we both did that for a number of years. But but with that said, obviously, with the Aerospace Corporation, what you did with the DOJ grant, looking at all kinds of technology, you started getting into some rather cutting edge sort of things, and you've been involved with drones for a very, very long time, and you do a lot with drones. And I gotta say, the reason I want to talk about this is, even though drones are in the news now, I reference drones regularly on various different networks. We'll talk about what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on, in the Middle East or what's happening on the border and stuff. And I will reference all the drone applications. whether it's for reconnaissance, whether it's weaponized drones used for strike missions or taking out targets. Certainly everything in the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb Strait that the Houthis are doing with drones, certainly what the Iranians are doing with drones, and then talking about things on the border, which certainly obviously for reconnaissance, but also for actually carrying loads of dope, drugs across the border. Drones have become somewhat ubiquitous across the board. So I wanted to spend today talking to you. You and Dr. Robert Bunker do just an amazing seminars, shall we say, workshops on drones, particularly weaponized drones. And I just wanted to kind of say, starting off with, where do you think from a homeland security perspective, what do you think that we're looking at in terms of where drones are going? Both the good guys and the bad guys.
Right. Well, as we both know, technology is a double-edged sword. It's neutral. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. I do think that the most advancement, and I take this from historical knowledge, the biggest advancement in technology, of course, is whenever there's a war. Mm-hmm. Right. And you can go back and you can look at World War I, World War II. The Civil War was the first time I found a drone-like attempt that turned into an actual drone when we learned how to do radio control, long-distance control of remote aircraft that wasn't manned. But I think there is a threat. One, because the FAA doesn't know what to do, how to control drones, right? It's worried about aviation safety. And all of a sudden it's got a million of these little things that it doesn't know what to do with. And so it's a problem. And it has to figure out how to regulate it, number one. Number two, you can use it for good or for bad. And lots of people are just interested because, in fact, we are, of course, fascinated by flying. Mm-hmm. The Homeland Security aspect is it's dense. There could be a lot. You've probably heard about prisons having to guard against drones dropping just simple things like supplies or cigarettes or such. Probably heard about the Canadian prison that they dropped a gun in the middle of the yard, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting things is along the border, sending drugs, is that we actually have no idea how many sorties back and forth across the border for the delivery of drugs there is. We know that there's some, but for every so many that we see, there are probably multiple sorties we don't see. So it's a problem. One of the things is detection. How do you detect a drone? Right now, you either hear it or you see it, but it's fast, it's small, it moves very fast, and you have trouble counting what's going on. And I think I've heard that there's somewhere between 1 and 2 million drones inside the United States, most of which are DJIs, which are made in China.
Now, I would just want to interrupt you here.
Yes, sir.
I just want to let everybody know that most of the mindless drones seem to be in Washington, D.C. I just want to point that out. But
that
anyway,
is,
well, yeah. Okay.
I probably should refrain from commenting on that, but I think you might be right. And you will see that people do things that are stupid. For instance, the federal worker who flew his drone in the middle of the night into the White House area. I don't think it was nefarious, but I would think it was stupid.
Yeah.
Things like that.
That's drone on drone, mindless drone with an actual drone. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
So, yeah. By the way, I should mention there's not just, a lot of times we talk about drones, we speak of unmanned aerial vehicles, but there's stuff that's on the water, under the water, stuff that moves on ground. Do you want to say anything about those?
Actually, as you probably know, I went to Camp Roberts frequently to the Naval Postgraduate School field experimentation on UASs, on drones.
Which I should mention is on the central coast of California.
It is on the central coast of California. It's very attractive. It has a herd of elk that are protected there as well. But anyway, as one of our experiments with the Aerospace Corporation, we used a remote boat with an aerial drone, and we coordinated with a cargo ship in San Francisco Bay to drive the drone ship alongside the cargo ship, then launched the drone for observation of the deck of the cargo ship. All coordinated and all demonstrating, if you will, how you could use both sea and air to do this kind of thing. While I was there, I was speaking to a manufacturer of underwater drones who was doing something for the Navy, and that's about all he could say. Mm-hmm. But it was a significant effort, and it was moving along quite nicely.
Yeah, it's actually amazing. You know, if you look at, for example, and I'm going to kind of switch gears here to overseas. If you look at what's happening over in Ukraine, you know, the Black Sea, where the Russian Black Sea fleet was essentially defeated by a country that had no navy. That's a historical first.
Yeah.
But what Ukraine had was drones. They had these unmanned surface vessels. There's been reports they have unmanned subsurface vessels. I haven't seen specific attacks, successful strikes tied to those, but there have been some indications that they have used those to some effect. But the unmanned surface vessels, of course, the unmanned aerial vehicles, they've used to great effect across the board. And so that's really just changed the whole dynamic of maritime warfare, if you will, naval conflict, is what we saw in the Black Sea. And that was pretty much a drone thing, which I find amazing. And then on the battlefield itself, and even well behind the battlefield, when we talk about, World War II, or even go through the Cold War and stuff, when you talk about strike missions, we normally think of a wave of bombers or fighter bombers or something that's going to come in and drop a lot of ordnance. All right. Now, when you look at what's happening in the Russo-Ukraine war, when they talk about strike missions, it's missiles and drones. Mm-hmm. It's all unmanned stuff. There's really very little, I'm not saying there's none, but there's very little actual manned strike missions. There are glide bombs the Russians are dropping, but even then, when you look at what's happening, and certainly on the front itself, the front lines, first person view drones. Do you want to say something? I mean, you and I have been talking about this for quite some time. We did seminars on this here in Southern California, out of state and stuff on this years back, going back well before the pandemic. And we talked about where this is going, and here you see it playing out. And to your point, this rapid fashion thing where you have a war. So what does it do to technology? Sudden rapid increases in technology. I think a lot of that has to do with, because the reason is because it doesn't get caught up in the bureaucratic gears. Yes. Because you got to get it out there. You got to get it. You want to use it. So in your mind, what are we learning from Ukraine that what are we seeing in Ukraine? And then how does that apply to the rest of the world, to include here at home?
I think you're seeing some dramatic innovation. Let me go back in time for just a second and say that there is precedence for this. During World War I, the Allies had the Kettering bug. What's the Kettering bug? The Kettering bug was an attempt to make a drone. It didn't do very well. The idea was that it would take off. It would count the propeller rotations. And when it hit a certain propeller rotation, it would stop and dive. And it actually carried a chemical weapon. It was a good idea, but it didn't work. One of the problems with it was the takeoff. The takeoff, a critical part of flight, it would crash on takeoff very frequently. They finally had figured out how to do it.
I can imagine with a chemical weapon, that could have some serious consequences. Certainly for anyone at that end of the airfield, I think they'd find it breathtaking.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Meanwhile, the Axis powers decided, since the takeoff is critical, they hung a drone, a glide bomb, if you will, from a Zeppelin. They would release it so they didn't have to worry about the takeoff part. And then they would guide it from the Zeppelin to a target. They were probably more successful. I don't really have any statistics on that. Break, go to World War II. Okay, World War II, what did the Germans use? The buzz bomb, right? The V1, the buzz bomb. Its target clearly was civilian casualties, London, et cetera, et cetera. What did the United States do? Because it was taking such casualties in the daylight strategic bombing in Europe, it created Operation Aphrodite. What's Operation Aphrodite? It took old worn out bombers. It filled them with explosives. it required a switch to turn on the explosives. And then the idea was it would go deep into Germany and hit the factories or bridges or strategic targets. So how did it avoid the worry of the takeoff? It asked for volunteer pilots to take off. They would flip the switch, then they would parachute out in Allied territory, and then it would be remotely controlled to a deep target in Germany. It didn't work. There were 17 missions. It mostly didn't work. The most famous casualty, volunteer pilot, was Joseph Kennedy.
Yeah. And actually, that switch mechanism had a few issues. And
yes, it did.
As my recollection was, they believed that when he hit the switch, he actually blew up the plane he was in.
I believe that's the truth.
Yeah. And of course, that had a little change in world history because, because he was supposed to be the one that ran for president.
He did.
And it didn't work out that way. So his younger brother actually ran for president.
And won.
And won. Yeah. So
indeed he did.
So it is amazing to see. Now, when you look at the surface drones and subsurface drones, and you've been doing a lot of work looking at the drug cartels in Mexico and Central South America across the board. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine, and you kind of look at what's sort of happening in Mexico, certainly in the Western Hemisphere along the southwest border, and I'm going to talk about stuff at sea, stuff that goes under the water, along with unmanned aerial vehicles. Where do you see it? Where do you see it now? And more importantly, where do you see it going in the next few years?
So let's talk about the cartels first, just in general, and the influence on what they're watching in Ukraine. They, of course, don't have the abilities and the factories and the capability to do what a state would do, like the Ukraine. But you have seen Dr. Robert Bunker, of course, is the one who's the big pro on that. And he knows all about the interactions of the drug cartels. And mostly it's competition between and among the drug cartels. But they have fashioned a weaponized drone. They have used a couple instances where they were threatening a drug cartel honcho, where they actually put a hand grenade taped inside a can and flew it into his yard of his house, not intending to hurt him, but to warn him that if he decided to do something, they had the capability to deliver a weaponized drone to his house. That's one thing. So that's interaction between the cartels. If you go to Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine war, you will see that there is development, measure, countermeasure, and the ability of delivering weapons is increasing, and the countermeasure is increasing. I believe it was Russia that because now there are electronic means to down the drones that are flying over the battlefield, Russia went to a optical wire system. I don't know if the audience is familiar with the tow weapon, but Hal is just like the tow, a wire-guided weapon, except it's fiber optic cable, so it can go way longer, it's way lighter, and it can't be interfered. There's no interference if it's trying to be countermeasured with electromagnetic.
Although there is a vulnerability there.
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
Yeah, there is.
If you want to mention what that is,
it's the wire.
Yeah. Right? Now, and by the way, I alluded to this. I even talked about it on the air. We're talking about some of the innovations out there, and I kind of alluded to this. But what are some of the things that can be done to interfere with the wire? I mean, literally, you could fly a drone with a rope and a small anchor, and just grab wires across the battlefield. But what are some other things? I'm hearing some other innovative concepts of what can be done.
One of the innovative concepts is to create something like a Faraday cage around a target. So, for instance, the tank or a Humvee, you could create a cage around it so that the drone actually hits the cage before it hits the target, and it blows up and it doesn't cause quite as much damage. I'm not sure, other than cut the wire or being able to separate the spool of fiber optic cable from the drone, what you could do. The other thing is, of course, trace to the controller, because the controller now has to be close and attached to the wire.
Right.
As opposed to the guy who's sitting back behind the lines drinking Red Bull and looking for targets.
I think you still have the same problem. I'm just hearkening back to the old, Dragon missiles and
Yep.
anti-tank missiles, stuff like that. There is only so far you can unspool that thing.
Correct.
You have a real limitation there just because of the wire itself. And I say that, I mean, it sounds kind of strange, but literally, the other thing too is drones are not like missiles. When you fire a missile, that thing moves so fast, there really isn't anything you could do to interfere with the wire. A wire-guided missile, well, the missile's moving extraordinarily fast. So by the time you think, oh, there's a wire behind it, you're pretty much trying to duck for cover to get away from the missile or whatever's happening. Drones are different. Drones move a lot slower. I've seen some very interesting concepts. One of the drones, to your point with the cage, the Russians started putting cages on tops of tanks. Of course, if they'd really thought that through, the drone simply goes and hits another part of the tank. So that was pretty much the end of the Russian tanks. But they tried to do that. That's a big problem that the Germans have with their Leopard 2. It's a very capable tank, completely vulnerable to drones.
Mm-hmm.
Never a consideration at all when they were designing the Leopard 2. So they have been having all kinds of problems. Other Western tanks are having problems with that as well because they weren't designed with drones in mind, so to speak. But, obviously the idea of sweeping the battlefield to, basically pick off or to scoop up or whatever the wires is one idea. And there's a certain hazard doing that as well. But the vulnerability is, say, well, what about trees and stuff? Well, that's the same problem they'd have if they had wires.
That's correct.
Where are you going to use this thing? Probably in a wide open area where you're not going to have trees because they have the same limitation, which is they can't, that thing's not going to move in and around trees and stuff because it's wire guided,
Yes.
and Murphy's Law, if nothing else, would seem to stop it because it get caught up in a tree. And then I see some cartoon thing where the drone's doing this around a branch or something. But the other thing too, I'm seeing stuff with nets.
That's
very interesting. Do you want to say something about nets? Because I find that potentially has huge homeland applications, especially with big events.
Yeah. I've actually seen a drone that is a net drone, and I've seen a round that actually homes in on the drone and then nets it, and it's gone out of the sky. Yeah, that has some potential. Ballistic spreading of nets as it gets close. And of course, there's always the bird of prey sending an eagle after a drone. The problem with that is they get tired and they get hungry and they lose attention. And if you can't eat the drone, they're not going to be that interested in it.
That's true. And drones are tough to eat. They really are.
They are tough to eat. And they're tough to grab. And it might hurt.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Some of those drones, let's just say, those props aren't just props; they're actual propellers. And
they're spinning knives. Actually, you could say that.
And unfortunately, some birds of prey have found that out the hard way. And
they have. Two interesting concepts on the battlefield that we have noticed. One is that drones can loiter. So they go to a tank. Let's say the tank buttons up. Drone turns off, but is nearby. They wait. They say, oh, drone must be gone. Open up, and the drone activates and blows up the tank.
It's a smart drone. Yeah.
Smart drone.
Well, actually, some of these loitering munitions, if you really get into it, are just drones. That's all they are. You can call them, we call them loitering munitions, but that's what they are. They're drones. They're just to have a limited time frame where they can loiter. And yeah. You want to say anything about those?
Well, the other interesting tactic that I was going to mention was something like a mothership with small drones. The mothership has a non-first-person view, and the little baby drones have first-person view. So the mama drone hovers around an area and looks for targets. When it finds one, it lets go of one of the baby drones with a bomb, which has first-person view. And think of it as it can't see all around like the mama drone is, but when it sees the target, it goes directly for the target and blows up. That's a pretty effective way to do it as well.
I've seen, it's interesting, obviously a lack of constraint For example, the Iranians, I believe they've developed a drone carrier, as they call it. That really, I think, just the term drone carrier caught everybody, by surprise when they said that. But again, first off, the Iranians can't build a real carrier because they just don't have the capability to do that. So they've built this, I think they brought in that famous global expert on designing stuff called Jerry Rigg to build this thing. Okay, I don't know if you know, Jerry Rigg has done so much over the many years.
He's been around for a long time.
He has truly an established reputation. And but they built these carriers, and it's interesting. It's like they're kind of unconstrained, and in that regard, because if we did it, we'd probably have to we design it, and then we'd make 50 modifications, and we'd take something that originally was going to be dirt cheap, and we make it the most expensive thing you'd ever seen it anywhere. But they don't have that limitation. They could just go out and say, let's try and do this. And so they've done it, and we'll see how it works out. And obviously the vulnerability there is if they sink the carrier, well, there's no drone threat from the carrier anymore. So but I do find that rather interesting. The other thing I was going to mention, you want to talk about some of the interesting drone stuff happening in the South China Sea, particularly with the Marine Corps doing the stay behind force concept or anything like that. Do you want to mention some of those interesting drone? It looks like it's going to be a drone intensive environment.
I think it's going to be a drone intensive environment. There was a push a while back, and it sort of backed off for every squad, every company, every soldier at one point in time to have a mini drone, so that and that's mostly for observation, so they knew what they were getting into. That mutates into things like a SWAT team sends in a drone before it actually goes in. A bomb squad sends in something to the dangerous area before it actually walks in. A hazmat team sends in with sensors and can sense what is going on, so they know what they're getting into before they actually do it.
Well, that segues into the drones as first responders.
Yeah, drones as first responders. That's right. I'm actually surprised the use of drones hasn't accelerated more than it has. I think there's a lot of innovation that seems obvious to me, but it hasn't come about just yet. Dr. Bunker talks a lot about the threat, right? And I'm sure glad he's on our side and not on the other side, because he comes up almost every day with things, and he knows how to and he comes up with a concept. How it actually comes into play, well, that takes a little bit. But the concept could be very dangerous if it was the wrong stuff.
It's interesting, and I've only been working in the area of public safety for 35 years. I don't know, a long time, since early mid 90s. And it's funny you say that. One thing I've noticed, and it's true with fire, law enforcement, whatever, is there's certain things in technology or concepts, if you will, conceptual approaches and things that would seem intuitive that seem to hit a wall of resistance. Yes. And the technology that seems to get adapted is the technology that doesn't significantly change the way things are. And I've always found that, I'm not saying the military is that much different. The Air Force has been dragging its feet on drones and unmanned combat aircraft and stuff for a long time. I did find it rather interesting that the B-20, the big the next generation stealth bomber, it is built for manned or unmanned. Yeah. So that, to me, that's like, there's your compromise. All right. Which is,
that's correct.
Everybody looking at the technology goes, why are we putting pilots in there? And they said, well, let's do both. Okay. And so, we could do it either way. I just thought that was kind of interesting, the way that was set up, that was designed that way to deal with that either way. So, I do too. Yeah. So anyway, that they have that all they have that kind of built in. But I've interesting. I think it's down on the border. I'm trying to remember the name of the city. It's down in San Diego area. They're using drones. Sacramento area, forget which city it is using drones. And part of this is For example, when you get into the incident action planning process, which really comes from the military planning process, they use a term called size up, if you will. Sorry about that. We got a little noise there. But they use a term called size up in terms of how they look at the situation, what do they need to bring in, stuff like that. And I look at this, whether it's a vehicle accident, whether it's, as you talked about, SWAT going into someplace, whatever it is, I just see, the ability to launch drones and get them there so quickly, would seem to make a lot of sense. And of course, Amazon, among others, is looking at delivery of drones, which I always found kind of interesting. Is like, what could possibly go wrong with an aerial vehicle with large propellers dropping a package in your backyard where your kids are playing?
Right.
What could possibly go wrong with that, or your pets are there, or something like that?
Right. Right.
But I do find it rather interesting that these applications are there, but it does seem to be kind of a little bit of foot dragging on the domestic side. A lot of it political foot dragging, political, I should say, bureaucratic, legal foot dragging as well. Some of it tied to the FAA, some of it tied to the FCC, for that matter.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's very true.
But then the other side is, on the battlefield, a little less constraint because of that. Do you want to say something to that effect?
Sure. It is actually like two very different worlds. To your point about dropping and picking packages up and things like that, there is some evidence that the Ukrainians have drones that have robot arms. And that they're actually going across into the Russian area and stealing Russian weapons and equipment, which I think is pretty innovative.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
And they don't actually have to worry about dropping it on the kid or the pet.
Or they could pick up Russians.
Or they could pick up Russians. That's correct. And
if anything happens, it's like, well, unfortunately, we had to jettison the cargo halfway back, but these things happen.
An unintended casualty.
Yeah, it's just, we tried to obey the Geneva Convention, but
Yes, and actually, we do show a film where an aerial drone, picks up a robot dog with a weapon.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah,
delivers to an area, and then the dog soldier, pardon the pun, goes on to do his thing.
And by the way, the bite is worse than the bark. I just want to point that out. But with that said, amazing stuff being done with these drone dogs. Yeah, it's amazing things being done. They've been weaponized. Also, all sorts of, sorry, got more noise in the background. Sorry about that. But all sorts of unusual things happening in terms of being able to go into areas, whether it's, with disasters where the buildings collapse or mines. That's a big area.
Mines is a big thing. Yes.
Do you want to say anything about that? And if I may, as long as we're taking a trip around the world, Middle East, you may have heard there's a tunnel or two in the Gaza Strip.
I have heard that. Yes.
So do you want to say something about the use of drones, particularly since we're on the concept of we will doggedly pursue this line of thought we've had, how that's being used with the tunnels?
Well, actually, one of the weaknesses of tunnels is you can actually take an observation drone and you could, in theory, map out the tunnels.
Yeah.
You could, in theory. Interestingly enough, I was at a drone conference in Alaska, of all places, and they were very innovative because, it's remote and they don't have a whole lot of resources such as that, and had a very interesting presentation by a guy who worked at a mine, and he had figured out how to program an aerial drone to go down into the mine shaft and identify people who might have been trapped or who might have had to shelter in place because of various things, and then create a plan to get them out. And the fact that you could, in theory, take an aerial drone and go find who needs to be rescued, who's alive, who's not alive, and then make a plan based on that reconnaissance, it was interesting. That was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And now today, you could do something with a ground drone and an aerial drone.
By the way, a snake drone.
A snake drone is a
I've
great
seen
idea.
that too, where they use the movement of a snake, which has tremendous application, particularly in, look, I'm not saying there's more disasters, but I think we're getting better at urban search and rescue. than
Yes.
we were before. And we're getting a little bit more innovative with that. And of course, getting into those closed spaces and stuff. So I do think some of these smaller drones, articulated drones that can move around corners and stuff in unusual ways, those have tremendous application in the search and rescue world. Of course, I've been a huge believer that we really have been slow in getting drones for search and rescue in wildland areas, national parks, state parks, stuff like that. Do you want to say something about that? Because
it's almost a no-brainer. As you probably know, I was a member of the National Institute for Urban Search and Rescue when it was going great guns, and it was started by Lois Clark McCoy, and it was created after I think it was the 1985 Kansas City pedestrian bridge collapse, and we just didn't have capability to help to get people out. Think about the advantage if you would have snake drones rather than just sniffer dogs that could go in, find people, identify them, locate them, and then extract them as quickly as possible. We could save probably a lot more lives in a disaster like that.
Well, the other thing, too, is we never can get enough trained search and rescue people in there.
No, we can't.
And it's impossible. Anytime I see these big disasters overseas, and then 3 days later they go, oh, the USAR team, the urban search and rescue team is showing up from from the U.S. and it's a recovery operation more than anything else. They're almost very rarely are they going to get somebody. They're going to find someone alive.
Correct.
And yet when you look at the possibility of using vast swarms, if you will, whether they're crawling on the ground or flying or whatever, of these smaller drones that can find people, figure out where they are. And I just look at they talk about the golden hour. Well, I'm talking about the golden hours or golden day or days that they can get in there and find someone, locate someone, and focus that search and rescue stuff rather than just pulling big chunks of concrete and bricks and everything from everywhere. You know exactly where you need to go.
Right. And if you know who you're trying to rescue, unlike a situation where you think someone is there, you can move those boulders and move that rubble in a meaningful way, in a knowledgeable way.
In a way that hopefully doesn't kill them while you're trying to rescue them. Right. Yeah. So that's a big one. And so I kind of stand back and go, And look, I'm going to tell you, there is a little bit with the first responder world. There's a little bit of protectionist stuff that happens. I knew someone who was in the fire prevention business and was doing a really good work in fire prevention to the point that the number of structure fires in the area were dropping tremendously because fire prevention was very effective. And he got pulled aside, and the guys in the regular fire department said, hey, knock it off, will you? You're kind of hurting the business, if you know what I mean. And we've heard that for years, with law enforcement. Yeah. That was always the thing. If you're really good at a crime prevention and the crime stats go down, that eventually somebody on the city council or the board of supervisors or whatever goes, well, why do we need so many officers and deputies? Because crime's down. It's like this continuous cycle where it's like, okay, so we'll have less, and guess what happens? Well, there we go. And but I do see this. For example, if there's an automobile accident, the ability to get something out there within minutes, something that's not tied up in traffic, not doing all that stuff, not putting everybody at risk at that, but could get there. You get eyes on target, so to speak. You can see, what is the situation? You can size it up. You can make some estimates of, how many people are hurt, maybe how badly they're hurt, what the situation is. And with that information, of course, putting things in action a lot faster. Because you say, oh, okay, we need this, we need this, we need this, and as opposed to sending out a vehicle for a traffic accident, and then they have to do that. I just see the OODA loop, observe, orientation, decision, act, the OODA loop cycle moving so much faster.
So much faster.
Yeah, and so much more effectively with the use of drones. But I do recognize that there will be some pushback, which is if you have your drone as your, quote, first responder, certainly someone where you look for the union label, someone is going to say, whoa, hold on there. That's kind of what we're doing, And so I see a challenge there, kind of like with the Air Force and
pilots.
And pilots. Yeah, they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, you can't put a silk scarf jauntily on a drone. It just doesn't work, So,
And I think some of that goes back to our fascination of flying as human beings. We live in 2 dimensions. And if you've never flown or you've never experienced how to be in 3 dimensions, it's very different. And a part of our weaponized drone course is we spend a lot of time saying, this is not a normal threat. This is a 3-dimensional threat. Mm-hmm. For instance, if you think you're in danger of a weaponized drone, you not only have to have cover, but you also have to have concealment. You actually need both because it moves so fast that you might, if you expose yourself for too long, the drone's going to find you. And it moves in 3 dimensions. It doesn't need to go around a corner. It can go over it or things like that. And it's not in our psyche as 2-dimensional beings to think of those kind of things.
It really does change it. I'll tell you who probably thinks about more, scout snipers. And of course, reconnaissance in general. Among other things, I spent time in the reconnaissance world. Mm-hmm. And we do think that way because when we're out there, we're usually, it's the old saying, I'm behind enemy lines. Well, that's kind of what reconnaissance does.
That's kind of what it does. Yeah.
If they're not behind enemy lines, what good are they? Either that or you're right up on enemy lines, but you got to be, that's kind of what it is. Yeah. And, but you also, even going way back, you always had to think about being seen from above. Mm-hmm. And because if you thought in 2-dimensional space, especially where you are, mm-hmm. there's no fallback. There's nowhere to go to. Mm-hmm. If they figure out you're there, you're done. So, mm-hmm. so you always had to think in 3-dimensional space. And I remember it was a little bit of a transition. You and I both started life honestly in the world of infantry and gruntdom. Yep. All right. And so we tend to think the way we think because of that. But I remember during that period, I decided, among other things, that was when I said, I'm going to go out and start skydiving. And before I before I even got my military wings, but my parachute wings, I should say, mm-hmm. I was an avid skydiver. And then I said, and I saw they're doing ultralight flying next door. And I go, well, I'd fly one of those ultralights. Yeah. Which, by the way, I don't care what movie you saw, very limited tactical value in that thing.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Yeah. But it was interesting. I just found it was very useful because it got me thinking in 3-dimensional space.
Yes.
It wasn't moving very fast in 3-dimensional space. I mean, it was an ultralight, but it got me thinking.
You were more of a target than a weapon, to be honest with you.
Pretty much. Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's just, again, the movies make it look exciting, but no. And look, Hamas did what they did in Gaza. They used that to great effect. They didn't really have anything else from the air. That was pretty much it for 3-dimensional. They could shoot rockets, or they could try those, well, they weren't ultralights. They were, motorized paragliders, basically, right. But which move even slower than ultralights.
And they're not very maneuverable, right?
They're not. And I kind of look at that and go, they were so vulnerable. You're getting into the what did Israel do wrong? And I always look at that and go, how could you not deal with that threat if you had sufficient forces right there? I mean, mm-hmm. They're not hard targets, But anyway, hey, we have been talking for quite some time.
I'm so sorry.
Hey, I just want to thank you, and of course, say "oorah" because that's the way we speak. All right, we got our language down to one term, and "oorah," and that's a whole conversation. Yeah. Yes. So anyway,
I know exactly what you're saying.
But Matt, thanks. I think you've opened up the eyes of drones, what's happening, where it could go. And for everyone, obviously, you may be getting this on the STRATpodcast.com. That's a great way to get it. This thing is also, of course, available on Captivate, Apple, pretty much anywhere you can get your podcasts. And then you can always see me in other segments. If you go to YouTube with Hal Kempfer TV, that's my channel. You'll see me in various news segments on things like Live Now from Fox, News Nation. I can mention a number of others. NPR. And Matt, you've said for years that you said I had a face for radio.
As do I.
Yeah, yes. Okay, all right. So anyway. Yeah. All right. So anyway. Hey, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Hal.
Thanks for being part of STRAT. All right.
All right. Out here.
Out here.